Another thing we want to talk about, one of my big takeaways from this past week, is that the Eagles, despite the dub on Sunday against the Washington Commanders, this is not the same Eagles team that we saw last year. They have yet to hit their stride in 2023. And I mean, let's just talk about it, man. I mean, they are undefeated. And obviously, it's a weird argument to say that this team isn't the same team as last year, especially when they're undefeated in their first four games. But I mean, I was watching it with an Eagles fan on Sunday, and this is just the same optimism, the same dominance that you were getting from Philly last year. You just aren't seeing it this year, and it's for a multitude of reasons. One of the big reasons is the injuries are really starting to stack up for this Philly squad, especially in the secondary. I mean, people who watched the game on Sunday, James Bradbury was playing safety for the majority of this game. And anybody who's been watching football over the past 3 or 4 years knows that James Bradbury is an all-pro cornerback, not a safety. So they are in dire straits going on in Philly, putting him out to the safety position. They had no Sidney Brown, no Justin Evans, both safeties. Corner Avonte Maddox is out for the season, so that sucks. So you already see the secondary starting to stack up with injuries, and you've got the big name guys. You've got Darius Slay, you've got James Bradbury. But beyond that, if you really start to lose your depth and you have to put James Bradbury at safety, you've got serious problems in Philly, especially on the defensive side for a team that prides themselves on defense. And this defense has not been the same as it was last season. I mean, the front seven is awesome. I mean, it's just the front line is awesome. There's no denying that. And it's going to be awesome for years to come. But this defense as a whole, as I was just talking about, so they had a 61.8 defensive grade against Washington. That averages out to 69.2 for the season. Last year, they had an 85.8 average grade over the entire season. So that's almost 20 slots on PFF, which is absolutely insane. They're allowing the sixth most passing yards in the league so far. So this defense is really struggling, and that's the main concern for me. I also think that Jalen Hurts doesn't look as good this year. This offense kind of seems like it's missing Shane Steichen a little bit. So I think there is some cause for concern in Philly despite the 4-0 record. But do you have anything to play it back against that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll push back a little bit because while I agree, like, this isn't the same Eagles team as last year. Last year's Eagles team was the best team from start to finish. Throughout the course of last year, they made it to the Super Bowl. They're a couple plays away from winning the Super Bowl. It's kind of hard to compare those teams, especially when you're looking at the record right now and it is 4-0. You know,
Why is it hard to compare those teams? They only got better on paper.
They
What
did
did they
kind of.
lose?
Javon Hargrave. They add in Jalen
Okay.
Carter, and I know that
Yeah.
he's doing pretty well. They lose Miles Sanders. They get DeAndre Swift in here as well. Look,
Who's been playing better?
I'm not saying. Well, okay, then what's the issue then?
No, I'm just saying. You're saying that they got this. You can't look at this as the same team from last year.
Well,
They only got better, and they're getting worse.
I'm saying
So,
that being worse than last year's Eagles team, not necessarily a bad thing. Because
okay.
right, we're gonna put out our power ranking. Like I said earlier, we're gonna put out our power ranking sometime in the next 24 hours. Eagles are probably gonna be in the top three, and that's just like they're 4-0. You know, they've won some close games. They've also dominated some teams. You know, they dominated the Bucks. They dominated the Bucks, but they win a close-ish game against Minnesota. They win a very close game here in Week 4. They get out to an early lead against New England, yeah, and then they kind of let them back in it. Jalen Hurts, I'll give you a little bit on that of just like, okay, maybe he doesn't look like he did last year, but kind of the same effect. Jalen Hurts, in my opinion, was the best quarterback in the NFL last year. He played like it from week 1 until he got hurt. And, you know, if he finishes those last 2 games, unless something, you know, absolutely terrible happens, he wins most valuable player over Patrick Mahomes. It was just a matter of he got hurt. But he was the best quarterback in the NFL last season. And he's still playing like one of the, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 best quarterbacks in the NFL this season. We had an A.J. Brown sighting for the first time in a few weeks, like a real, true A.J. Brown sighting. This week, he got in the end zone once or twice. Had a couple big plays in there as well. So you love to see that. But it's kind of hard to like criticize this team because you're trying to compare them to one of the best teams. Like last year's Eagles team was one of the best teams that we've seen probably in the last 6 or 7 years. You know, from start to finish in the regular season, they started out 11-0, and it wasn't like a Steelers 2020 11-0. Like it was like they're beating the crap out of teams, 7 to 8 of those weeks, and they're still a really good team. Like I'm not worried about the Eagles. You look in this conference, you see San Francisco, you see Dallas right now. I still think they've got just as good a shot as anybody in the NFL to go to the Super Bowl. I know it's still
Which
early.
was not the case last season. Which was not the case. Like you weren't saying that statement about the Eagles last year. Like they have just as good of a shot as anybody. This was like, no, it's the Eagles and everybody else. It's the Eagles, Chiefs, and then you got the rest of your teams who have an even shot. Like this is a completely different conversation we're having about a team that went to the Super Bowl last year.
I get it, but okay. So the thing is, the headline is the 2023 Eagles haven't caught their stride yet. And while I think that's true, if this is the team that hasn't caught their stride yet, I'm really afraid to see what they look like when they catch their stride. I'm really afraid to see that, because if they catch their stride, we could be talking about another 11-0 start. Like they're 4-0. They've beaten not the greatest of competition. I'll give you that.
In close games, dude. I mean, if you're watching the game on Sunday, like we're one Terry McLaurin foot inbounds over a forearm away from driving down the field and winning the game in overtime.
Well,
like I mean, and then what's the conversation we're having today?
We're having a slightly different conversation, but it's probably much more like, oh, Washington's for real, yada yada, than it is like Philly is a disaster.
Didn't need that tone on that. Didn't need that tone on that. Just to say.
But okay. you look at these next few weeks for them. You go to LA, even though the Rams have their fans, I think Philly still might make that 30-70 split in the crowd. Then they go to MetLife to play the Jets. Then they do have Miami, and then it's the Commanders again. Then you play Dallas in Week 9, and then you get a bye, and then you get Kansas City, Buffalo. You got a rough. Oh my God! They get Dallas bye week, Kansas City, Buffalo, San Francisco, Dallas.
Oh,
Seattle. God. So they better start hot, and we might be having a different conversation in the middle of those weeks there. But I'm not worried about the Eagles. If that's that's the all-encompassing take here. Is I'm not worried about Philadelphia one bit. I think they could be 6-7-0, and we're talking about them in the same way we're talking about all these other contenders.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I'll give it to you. I mean, I think if injuries really start to stack up, though, continue to stack up.
Now that's one thing, because last year Philly was pretty far ahead as the healthiest team in the NFL. They didn't really suffer any injuries outside of Jalen Hurts missing those last few weeks, but by then they had, more or less locked up the 1 seed. And even when you put Gardner Minshew in there, they still went out and scored like 35 points against Dallas, who was one of the best teams in the NFL last year as well. It's just the whole roster is so well equipped to deal with injuries. We talked about that front group of guys, that pass rush, where it runs 8 or 9 deep. Like they could just rotate these guys in and out. And that is part of why they stay so healthy, is because they're not playing guys 100% of the snaps on defense. They can rotate these guys in and out. Now, when you start losing guys on the back end, that's going to make things a little bit more difficult for you. It's kind of a Darius Slay, James Bradbury centered secondary. And if those guys are out, you're a little bit more concerned specifically about this defense. Or if one of them's
playing safety.
Or if one of them's playing safety.
Which is happening right now, by the way.
Also, you lose one of these playmakers, and again, this is a little unfair to be like, oh, well, what if this team loses their best wide receiver? Then what happens? You do that with anybody. But this offense can, if the running game isn't working on a day and they're missing one of these wide receivers, which they might get some regression to the mean happening with their injuries, that's when you start getting worried. But as of right now, man, it's kind of hard to pinpoint something and be like, okay, this is what's wrong with Philadelphia, because there's not a whole lot to point at.